This is a section on Becker's scholarship in general, and it tries particularly to cover the scholarship prior to SFU, but anything I say here should also be seen as applying quite equally to the work after Simon Fraser. Any additions that happen at Simon Fraser I'll deal with in the immediately succeeding section. Now, the thing that you have to understand, and it took me a while to get this, and this is why I'm going to be kind of pedantic about it, is there's a term that has sometimes been used about Spinoza's work and certainly about Sigmund Freud's work. That's what's central to it, and it's certainly central to Ernest Becker's work, is the Latin, it's described in the Latin phrase causa sui, C-A-U-S-A S-U-I, causa sui. What does it mean? It's complicated. Causa sui basically is the idea that of something having a cause in itself, in its own constitution, being self-constituting. And this is something that is generated within. Now, when Spinoza used the term, he wasn't thinking particularly of people, but Freud was, and so was Becker. People are different from other things in the universe, in the cosmos, because they, whether they like it or not, are caught up in a necessary causa sui project. They recognize that they experience life as individuals. They obviously are social beings who belong together. They couldn't be individuals if it weren't for their social commitments and obligations, interactions, especially with parents, guardians, and so on. But they experience their life toward their death. They're the members of Homo sapiens sapien apparently are the only members of any species who know they're going to die. And this is worrisome. It can be quite terrible. This means that we feel perhaps an extra compulsion to do something, to make our lives count in some way, to achieve some sort of agency, to do something that puts us on the map, to generate a kind of self-regard that isn't pretentious, but that takes ourselves seriously and our possible work in the world seriously. This is absolutely essential to get this idea for Becker. I'm not trying to claim that everybody has this, but he had it big time. So did Freud. Both Becker and Freud as children were beset by night terrors, by death anxiety, frequent attacks. Becker was precocious as a child. There's a story of him with a good friend, a Greek-American boy, saving up their pennies for months until they have sufficient numbers that they can go downtown and throw them against the bank wall, and as there are people coming out, and just to watch what the people do. This was an experiment of sorts. It was a kind of demonstration of sorts. He was curious. He was curious about why people in general, he too as an individual, why we do the things we do. What are the mainsprings behind these actions? A lot of it, as you'll see, is caught up in this notion of causa sui, because causa sui itself is actually an immortality vessel. It is something that can be used to make our stamp, an imprimatur that we carve into our existence in the world. And Becker's work is his attempt to carve on that particular tree. Now, he was obviously an interdisciplinarian. What he's trying to do, and here I'm not going to go into specific detail, I'm going to give you the kind of bare bones template that I think runs through most of his work. He's trying to create a synthetic science of man, one that will illuminate the human experience and the human condition, something that will be as true as possible for as many of us as possible. He recognizes that this can't be in our biology, it can't be in our socialization, but it's in our situatedness, it's in our being, our belonging to others, while we simultaneously try to be ourselves and are living toward death. We cannot help but be concerned about our lives and our deaths in ways that matter. And all social scientists, any scholar, anybody living, Becker believes, ought recognize this. He thinks it's an absolutely abominable crime, that it would be funny were it not so terrible, that most social science doesn't deal with these issues in the right, in what he regarded as a serious way, not the right way, as a serious way. He wanted people to be serious about their lives and death. The other part of this casus sui stuff is that Becker is influenced, he writes in a couple of places, you know, I'm an Old Testament Jew. He doesn't believe necessarily in an all good, benevolent, at all times God, an omnibenevolent God, although he does in the cosmos in a sense. But what he really expects is that, and this is where Becker is kind of like, I think, a lot of men. He kind of expects that if there is a God, and if he's going to be good enough for God and have God have any sense of his life and do anything for him, he's got to stand on his own 2 feet first. And this is his requirement. So he has to show himself worthy. He has to show himself as passing tests. He has to make his gift. Yeah, I think he sees this in lots of ways, and he starts to see it more and more in the time at Simon Fraser. And whether he's religious in any conventional way is very difficult to gather. Sometimes he seems to be, other times he's not, and it seems to depend to a certain extent on his interlocutor with whom he's interacting, and so on and so forth. But having said all of that, he takes religious belief, any kind of spirituality, very seriously. And this is what he wants. He wants people to not be dismissive, to take it seriously. Now, all of this that he wants to do, this explication of the science of man, when he talks about that, his explication of human nature and the human condition, this is what philosophers have referred to as a philosophical anthropology. He wants to understand, he wants to have a philosophy of what it is to be human as we experience it in our existence. In our existence is kind of caught between the angels and other animals. And sometimes a philosophical anthropology, more technically, is considered to be a kind of metaphysics and phenomenology of the human person in her relation to others and to the world. And I think that's a good way of describing Becker's work. So as he comes to Simon Fraser University, Becker was beginning to struggle with a real problem, and that's the problem that he describes toward the end of, in the epilogue actually, to his 1968 book, The Structure of Evil, as his inability yet to fully come to grips with the problem of human evil. See, there's a kind of, well, theodicy is that part of theological study, if you will, that is concerned about a particular problem. How is it that an omnipresent, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God can allow or can coexist with human evil, with the kind of real atrocities that beset humankind almost from the beginning? And certainly the 20th century was littered with these kinds of events. How is that possible? Now, you see, Becker actually, in a way, I think, converts that, and Dan has said something quite similar to this, as a kind of anthropodicy. And this is, he's not immediately concerned with the problem of how God can do this, because if there is a God, God's God. But he sure as heck is concerned about how people can do this, because we have lots of good things going for us. How is it that we, individually and collectively, can allow these kinds of horrific things to happen and sit placidly by as they continue to occur, or even when they're immediately occurring? This is his problem. This is what he's after. He wants an answer to that kind of thing. He can't have a science of man. His philosophical anthropology will not be complete until he understands this, until he has a better answer than the one he's been able to give to himself solely. Okay? Now I want to leave that general description of his scholarship because I want to talk specifically about the way he worked. And this is where I want to connect his life to his work in even a deeper way. Becker, as I've already mentioned, didn't have the apprenticeship in even the usual qualitative methods, empirical methods of sociologists and anthropologists. He didn't really use any kind of ethnography, any kind of participant observation. He sure as heck didn't crunch any numbers, collect any standard data, and so on and so forth. So what did he do? What gives him the right, the self-appointed right, or the university-sanctioned right, to talk about our living and dying to us in the way that he tries to do? This is an interesting question. And it comes, in answering it, I've really discovered a lot about Becker again. So I need to just tell you some stories about how he worked. In short, he read, but he read carefully. And he read repetitively the same text over and over and over again. And the texts that he really thought were important, he annotated very, very carefully, especially the books that are, as some of you know, in the Columbia collection. And there are books as well that bear these kinds of marks in the Samish Lake cabin. Becker converses. He's the student of the author. And he's also the gadfly trying to get under the author's skin. Why does this happen? I think this is wrong. I think this is right. This is wonderful, marvelous. Yes, but you see this, if it connects to that, then you can take this even further. And so when he runs out of, annotating, he's got a nice clear hand. When he runs out of annotating the covers, then he'll insert and glue in other papers, right? So these are little works in themselves. These are like mini theses whenever he reads a book that's really important to him. And it's a conversation he's having. What he's trying to do, in the words of his longtime friend at Syracuse and still friend Ron Leifer, is he's trying to stand on the shoulders of giants. He's trying to take, in an almost Matthew Arnold, old-fashioned sense, the very best and brightest of all the ideas he can garner and bring to bear on his project. What is relevant? He wants to penetrate known human thought so that he can bring in as much as possible and consider it. He's willing to reject things, accept things, but he's constantly learning and constantly shaping. See, first, his method is that he's a learner. And then he's the teacher, then he writes. And then when he writes to learn as well. He writes to see what he thinks. This is why his writing is a little all over the place. I mean, even Denial of Death, as marvelous as it is, could sure as hell use the hand of a good editor, even after all the editing it received. There's no question about this. But Ernie writes in a white heat. He's in the moment. He's now going to make his mark. He's going to achieve his causa sui. He's going to do it. And he can't be set aside. Nothing will stop him when he gets flowing. And he will write late into the evenings, early in the mornings, breaking, to eat maybe, and that kind of thing. So this is his life. His work is his life in a large way. Obviously, Marie and the children are his life too. There's lots of private life in Becker, in his letters. He has very good friends that he stays in touch with. But it always comes back, even in these other letters, to his work, what he's trying to accomplish, what he's trying to do. So he wrote to clarify his ideas. When he would meet someone I was just saying to Phil before this started, when he would meet someone that he thought was even remotely interesting, one of the first things he would do was to ask her to tell him what the most important books were that she'd read. And he would make notes, or he would ask her to drop a memo or send a note. And he would find the books, and he would see what he thought about them, see whether there was anything in them. And this is the way he worked. He had index cards. Those of you who have been at the cabin at Lake Samish know. These index cards with these files, old tin files with index cards. And these connect his annotations in one book to another. Or they connect some of his own emerging ideas before and where he wants to take them. And sometimes both of those kinds of things. So, as a bit of historiography, you can really kind of follow Becker's work and where he goes from where, if you can kind of get some of these things dated, and I think it's possible to do much of that, to see where his ideas are moving. This is the way he's worked. He's a meticulous scholar, but he's also a little disjointed because of the way in which he collects information. Nonetheless, let's be clear about one thing. He does have a penetrating knowledge of the Western canon. The Structure of Evil, the 1968 book, is as good a read as I have ever had of the classics, right from the Greeks and Romans through to people like Hobbes and Locke. And some of his readings are really instructive because he takes a much more social and cultural reading of John Locke, for example. And many people are now saying, you know, that's how we ought to be reading John Locke. We've missed him as saying he's too much about individualism. So Becker is canny. He's really worth reading in that way. He's a real scholar, and yet he's kind of an odd scholar. He's kind of got this idiosyncratic way in which he works and does things. I want to make rather quick mention of a couple of ideas, pre-SFU ideas, because they help play through some of the things I want to say about the dark turn, so-called, at Simon Fraser. He's a post-Freudian. That doesn't mean that he agrees with Freud. That just means that he takes Freud seriously and that he moves where Freud started, but he moves in different ways. So the main difference between Becker, well, one of the main differences between Becker and Freud is Becker really doesn't think the Oedipal complex as developed by Freud is the right way of understanding human development. He's not denying much of what Freud said. But he thinks it doesn't really penetrate, it doesn't go far enough. See, the real problem isn't just lusting after one of your parents and going after an identification with the other one, et cetera, all that kind of stuff, as important as that might be for some people. But it's actually this task that he's taken on himself, is trying to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. See, the real danger is that your parents, your guardians and others will not allow you to do this. They won't allow you to follow where you want to follow, follow who you want to follow, go where you want to go, because they expect you to behave appropriately and well in circumstances that they're involved with, that you're involved with them. But all of this good behavior actually can have the disastrous effect of allowing us never to really cultivate those things that we really are best able to do, that are nearest and dearest to us. That stuff kind of goes underground. So we really can't stand on our own 2 feet. We can't really garner appropriate real, not pretend, but actual self-esteem and real self-regard until we have our project. And this can prevent us from having our project. And Dan has written eloquently about Becker's reworking of the Oedipal complex. So I'm just going to move quickly. But you can actually, just one thing, you can see in Angel in Armor, this is a quote that I unfortunately didn't duplicate for you, but I'll just read it to you. You can see where this is all going to go in a certain sense. In this quote from pages 188 to 189, it's not man's biological aggressiveness, but rather his fearfulness and automatic submissiveness to authority, right? God, my parents screwed me up. Now the damned government's screwing me up. Christ, who can you depend upon, et cetera, right? It's all this stuff. This is the sickness at the heart of the creature. This is what makes him so terrible. Human evil is created, not animal inspired, with reason and thought. He might have a different destiny if he could but see through his Oedipus or early training and come to identify the unconscious rooting of his own sense of self. Right? So you can see that where that this is all connected up with evil. Our not knowing ourselves predisposes us in a certain way to evil, to at least the sanctioning of it, and sometimes to the doing of it. But he's still unsatisfied with where he is with that. One other thing, this is directly from Dan, and it's very important in my opinion. This is Becker's sense of an expanded transference. Freud, of course, is dealing mostly with therapeutic transference, the tendency of a particular patient or a client to project her or his loves and hates and relationships with others onto the relationship between the therapist and her or him. And as Dan so eloquently says, this is a direct quote, from infancy on, we gird ourselves to the demands of the world by sheltering ourselves within that which symbolically represents higher power. Parents, therapists, but not just parents and therapists, also our society, our culture, our God, our heroes, both symbolic and actual. As an Enlightenment scholar, somebody who thinks we can understand things in a way that can improve our individual and collective lot, Becker believed we can come to understand the dynamics of our transference, their costs and benefits, and eventually learn to cultivate transference objects that are more beneficial than harmful. He really believes that. And this is all caught up with his basic belief in human development. He doesn't think we're born one way or the other. I mean, he's not denying that there are tendencies that we have that may have some naturalness about it. But it's really our experience in the human condition that determines things. It's our acting in the world, our interacting in the world. And he has this principle of human development that is absolutely essential for the science of man. And prior to coming to Simon Fraser, this is directly caught up and involved with this achieving and maintaining of an honest and legitimate self-regard and the self-maintenance. Right? Not false hubris. Not a kind of, these are your 10 ways to develop self-esteem. Say them before you go to bed and when you wake up. Not that kind of stuff at all. Becker actually is very against that kind of pop psychology. He wants people to be serious. He's very witty. He has fun. But about what you should be serious about, he thinks you should be serious. Obviously, education is extremely important. Both formal education, the kind of thing that the Ernest Becker Society Foundation does. This is extremely important. I want to just, because of all of this, you need to be well educated. And he thought education could help people penetrate their own causa sui projects, to recognize them, to move with them. Becker characterized the educational system as a great conversation carried on by communities of learners. And this would involve scientists, scholars, students, investigators, lay people. This was his basic description of an ideal social existence in the ideal, real democratic state. This is almost Platonic in a certain sense, but it goes beyond Plato because there's an instantiation of the ideal. This is a state in which the expansion of maximum individuality within maximum community might be achieved. This is his basic maxim. Again, Dan captures this so nicely in both The Reader and also in his 1995 book. It was Becker's basic form and template for human progress and enlightenment, this kind of education. He's like Hannah Arendt. You need to contribute to a society. You need to take a stand. You need to say things. And if you don't do this, you rob the society of your views. This is a basic requirement and a basic benefit of a free and honest exchange of ideas and views. And this is the only way to work against our alienation and our fears.